My name is Gloria Morales Osorio. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Corinna Zeltsman, and to describe the structure of this event. This is the first public event of Archives in the Americas, our Jesse Mellon interdisciplinary workshop in the humanities, sponsored by the Center for the Humanities at UW. One of our goals is to reflect on the material and effective properties of archives in Latin American and Latinx contexts, and Dr. Zeltsman's trajectory productively helps us see archives in a political matter. Here, I'm using matter both as a topic and as any physical substance. Dr. Zeltsman is an assistant professor of history at Princeton University. Her research focuses on printing and the book, political culture, and labor in 19th and 20th century Mexico. Her training as a letterpress printer also shapes her research and teaching, which explores Latin American media and material cultures. Her book, Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th Century Mexico, edited by the University of California Press in 2021, has been awarded with the Howard F. Klein Prize in Mexican History by Latin American Studies Association, LASA, in 2022. The Best Book in the Social Sciences, Mexico section, also by LASA in 2022. And the Murdo J. MacLeod Book Prize by the Latin American and Caribbean section in the Southern Historical Association 2022, just to name a few recognitions. She has also published works on the history of freedom of press law in early Republican Mexico and about collecting and preserving colonial Latin American materials, among other topics. She recently contributed to the book Latin American Literature in Transition, Volume 2, published by Cambridge University Press, with a chapter titled The Material and Cultural Politics of Publishing. In March of this year, she received a grant for the National Endowment for the Humanities to conduct research for a book currently titled Making Paper in Mexico, A Material, Political, and Environmental History. Dr. Zeltsman's visit to this campus is possible thanks to a partnership between the Center for the Humanities and the Rare Book School. This alliance speaks of the breadth and impact of Professor Zeltsman's work, since her reflection about labor, print culture, and materiality captivate and inspire scholars interested in archives, urban political cultures in Latin America, and the physical presence of printed materials. Her research invites us to recognize compositors and printers as complex participants in the letter scene, as miners of thought, or mineros del pensamiento, which is part of an anonymous poem published in the press in 1884. In the 19th century, compositors and printers not only produced documents that imagined Mexico as an independent and new nation, but they also set type for themselves to place collective authorship and workers' rights in the public sphere. Dr. Zeltsman's book, Ink Under the Fingernails, shows how, in the use of every metal type, there is a tension between freedom and stability, between the transformative power of what is printed and the political danger of any document circulating. Finally, I would add that Professor Zeltsman also shows us how to read and deal with ephemera, with broadsides or type specimens, how to grasp their volatile existence, and how to include those kind of documents in our discussions on what a text is and what a text does. This conversation will be moderated by Dr. Victor Golgel Carballo from the Spanish and Portuguese Department at UW-Madison, and Dr. Joel Melendez-Badillo from the History Department at UW-Madison. First, Dr. Zeltsman will share a short provocation with us to start off the conversation, and then Professors Golgel and Melendez will ask some questions, and finally we will open both floors for some comments or questions from our audience today. If you are joining us via Zoom, feel free to share your questions in the chat anytime, or raise your hand at the end of the talk if you want to share your camera under mic. We thank the Center for the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the support from Nancy and David Borgesi and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We also thank the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows of Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. So like, I don't need to give my provocation. And I'm really grateful to the sponsors, the Center for the Humanities and the Rare Book School for allowing me to be here. And of course, to all of you in the room and to folks on Zoom, it's really an honor. I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you. Thanks for taking the time to engage with my work. And I'm super excited to talk about the politics of paper and print, or print and paper. I study these questions, as we know, in the context of 19th and 20th century Mexico, which you may know is the site of the oldest printing tradition in the Western Hemisphere. That's like my little, factoid that always goes with me everywhere I go. And I just wanted to provide a super brief introduction to Mexico's sort of print world and some of the arguments that I make about it to give everyone a bit of an orientation to the conversation. I think I'll talk more about print now, and paper maybe will come up a bit in the Q&A. So Mexico's print world, right? Print production was highly centralized in Mexico, and it had been since its beginnings in the 16th century. It is a craft that is closely regulated through a mix of sort of censorship, patronage that created these close ties between authors, printers, and royal and religious authorities. And Mexico City printers, like their counterparts all around the Americas, produced for local markets, but they depend on imported supplies, everything from printing presses to type and paper that comes from Spain for their workshops. And when the Spanish Empire collapsed in the early 19th century, basically these political and commercial relationships also sort of unraveled. And that's precisely the moment where my work begins. So after independence in 1821, Republican governments start to try to build liberal legal regimes within this context that's marked by economic penury, by political instability, foreign invasion. And as state censorship is replaced with this new and kind of unknown concept of freedom of the press, this very boisterous world of printing politics begins to emerge. Political elites of all stripes try to use print to gain office, to build a functional nation state, to punish their enemies, immortalize themselves. In the public record, I think that's one of the main reasons people print. Mexico's printers, meanwhile, really flourish, but also struggle in this new environment. They're the publishers of partisan newspapers. They juggle patronage, job commissioned work, editing activities, and they embrace politics as really key to their business strategies. And their activities bring them, a modicum of power, but it also attracts that scrutiny from all of these anxious officials, right, who are trying to build the shaky nation state. And all of Mexico's governments across the spectrum proclaim the support for freedom of the press, and they invoke these lofty liberal ideals. But of course, this rhetoric coexists with the constant effort to establish limits around public speech and to sort of tame this boisterous world of printing politics. And as officials struggle to rein print in, they have to grapple with the pragmatics of regulation, which means confronting the actual and nitty-gritty practices and communities of printing itself. So who is ultimately responsible for a controversial printed text? In the 19th century, that's not an easy question to answer because printing is a complex practice, or a practice that encompasses a large range of actors with various relationships to the text that they produce. So, anyone from the semi-educated owner of the printing shop to the formally educated writers who are paid by the printer, or the literate worker compositors and the typesetters, compositors, the press operators, illiterate servants, everyone who's sort of together in the printing shop contributing to these materials. So figuring out who did what and who actually knew what about texts was not an easy task. And so to confront this reality, officials developed this category of the responsible party, the responsable, a person who sort of signed their name on a sheet of paper like this one, taking responsibility for a text which was kept on file in the printing shop as kind of collateral against a legal violation. But printers and authors developed workarounds to evade responsibility. And in this document, for example, the individual who signed his name, Rodrigo Salvatierra, was at the time of this investigation into a controversial text that was accused of libel, was nowhere to be found. So in his absence, who do we blame, right? The lawyer representing the bishop, who was angry about some slight against his honor, points his finger at the printer. And he accused him of being more criminal than the author, since, quote, the author is nothing more than a mercenary who lends himself to sign whatever is presented by the printing shop for a miserable sum, or maybe is not even paid, end quote. So here the lawyer is sort of inverting the liberal norms that we cherish about authorship, right? The printer is the agentive force. The author is just a smokescreen who's sort of hooked up to hide the shady workings of printers. And the lawyer is clearly looking for like a culprit for the crime. But his argument reflects really how throughout the entire 19th century, this question of printers' responsibility lies at the heart of efforts to try to define and regulate press freedom, which in itself is sort of linked to the broader question of state formation and government sort of ability to wrangle in everyday life. So printers weren't just the object of regulation, and they also became partisan activists who tried to reshape the rules by arguing that press freedom depended on printers' freedom. And this activism challenged efforts that were really promoted by conservatives to broaden legal responsibility for text to include everyone in the print shop, basically print workers, and by the end of the 19th century, even printing technology itself. So this image has an image of this snake of censorship tightening around a mechanical printing press, and it's not really metaphorical. It actually refers to this practice of seizing printing presses as instruments of a crime, as if they're like a knife in a stabbing, which becomes a practice that's used in like 19th-century Mexico. So printers activism supported, in contrast to these conservative efforts, liberal efforts to sort of tighten legal responsibility around this figure of an individual. Liberals argued that if you hold printers responsible for press crimes, you essentially create a new version of what was the despised institution in the worlds of the liberals of the Mexican Inquisition, right? You create this new Inquisition, except it's staffed not by clerics, but by artisans, uneducated artisans without the faculties to judge the works of their social superiors. So for liberals, printers should function sort of theoretically and practically as a kind of extension of their presses. And the author's will should be able to flow through, like freely through this technology. And work should be judged not by printers in the back rooms of the print shop, but by a jury of authors' peers, right, in the public eye. So printers, despite the fact that they sort of support liberals' aims ultimately, they reject those arguments that position them as these kind of unthinking extensions of their presses. And type compositors in particular, as Llorel knows from his work, develop a very rich body of craft-specific discourses that emphasize their role as these co-producers of text. Which hopefully we'll get to talk about a bit more later. And printers' efforts to define press freedom as printers' freedom actually sort of win to a certain degree in the sort of trajectory of press freedom's history in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, which in 1917 drafts a revolutionary constitution that prohibits the seizure of printing presses. And it actually includes sort of explicit guarantees for print workers, kind of elevating them as a specifically laboring category into the text of the Constitution itself. But revolutionary lawmakers were ultimately unwilling to altogether abandon that category of responsibility for text, legal responsibility. And so it remains, it's sort of placed back into the mix at the same time that printers are given special protections. And that means that printers were winners and losers in this long-running conversation about textual responsibility. So their success at inserting themselves into that political conversation ultimately means that production is going to continue to be a terrain of negotiation for 20th century media makers. That's my provocation, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Corinna. I'm Victor Golpe Camacho. I'm a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and as Gloria mentioned, I'll moderate this boisterous conversation. Or you can each take responsibility for what you say. Thanks so much, Gloria, for having the initiative for the workshop, for inviting Corinna, and for organizing this. We imagine this space as a very non-regulated conversation space, so feel free to be boisterous, interrupt, ask questions. We have a few questions prepared, but I want to begin by asking if anybody was provoked enough to not be able to wait anymore and make a question. I don't want to put too much pressure, but in any order we go.
I have a silly little question. The snake was inscribed with the word psicología.
Yes, what's that about? Psicología was the term used to describe, it was a concept developed in Porfirian Mexico during the Porfiriato to refer to the way that press crimes or crimes in general were adjudicated by judges. And this is something Pablo Picasso writes about, that basically the idea was the mind of the judge is like where the adjudication of the crime happens. So it can't, it's part of the Porfirian process of criminalizing press infractions and sort of taking them out of the hands of press juries, which had functioned in the first half of the 19th century, and then kind of consolidating state power over these crimes of honor that, you know, calls them crimes of honor. So psicología was basically the shorthand for like the censorial judicial regime that had been erected by Diaz. Yeah.
It's a form of jurisprudence, a weird form of.
Yeah, and then, you know, exactly, it's like, it's something internal psychological kind of legal reckoning. It can't be questioned because it's infallible. That was part of the. Yeah.
Thanks, very interesting.
Jarrell, I didn't mention that you're also moderating.
Yeah, so part of the reason why I sat here is because we wanted for this to feel informal, more of a conversation. We do have some questions, and hearing you, it generated more questions that I want to ask. So maybe I'll just start there instead of the questions that we already have in a Google Doc. So I wanted to ask you about the writing process and the conceptualization of the book itself. I think one of the most fascinating things about the book is its multi-layer analysis of different subjects, right? It's not about solely printers. It's also about the state. It's also about how people were interpreting these things that were being printed. So I wanted to ask you how that came to be, and particularly in both the introduction and the Hispanic American Historical Review article, you talk about sort of the historiographical analysis of the press as this sort of, you know, amorphous sort of thing, the press, right? And I think your book is doing exactly, you know, it's adding to that conversation, but also highlighting the press is all of these multiple subjects and people. And so I wanted to ask basically about the conceptualization of the book, about the archival process, how that came to be. And then another sort of question about the transnational dimensions of this, because one of the arguments that I think someone did in one of the cases was like, you know, we can't actually figure out who produced this piece because all of the printers in Mexico use the same sort of imported materials, right? Where ideas of where they see themselves as in dialogue with peers outside of Mexico. You know, Gutierrez for me it's a very interesting case because he comes to Mexico after traveling through Europe for a couple of years, and so I was wondering about sort of the transnational dimensions of the print shop itself, the folks inside of the print shop.
I love those questions. And of course, all historians, we love to talk about our archival methods and our, I would think that the project really began with, I think some historians come to their research from a historiographical standpoint, like they want to fill a gap or ask a specific question, and others come with a passion for a topic and then find their way to where it fits, right? I think there's different kind of ways into it. And I'm definitely in the nerdy, like obsessive person section of where I had this project where the question kind of emerged more out of my life outside of academia, that I worked in these in art centers that were worked on, like the Center for Book Arts in New York. And, you know, I was around this sort of world of people talking about print and the history of print, and Latin America like never came up on the radar. So I sort of wanted to know, having studied Latin American studies as an undergrad, like where that story fit. And that kind of led me to create the project as a kind of question of curiosity. And then I kind of, in the archive, was just following printers around, right? Like just trying to see where they would pop up, like how I could find the print shop, kind of imagining it as a social history of the print shop. And of course, the archive brought me towards questions that were more about like legal questions, politics. I never imagined I would study politics, but of course, it's absolutely like, how could I have thought that printing and politics are not completely linked? Probably because in the 21st century, to print doesn't necessarily have the same kind of, it's a different thing than it was in the 19th century, right? So I learned about this sort of the political world and then eventually the legal world. And then and as I was kind of going through the process of just finding printers anywhere I could in the archive, figured out how to link it up with historiographical debates and sort of realizing that there's this kind of scholarship on the history of the book that has really pioneered the work in, scholars based in Mexico, Laura Suarez de la Torre, and all of her work around. She has a whole, kind of group of people who are now really important kind of cultural histories of the book. That had less to do with the political angle. And in the US, there's a lot more scholarship on press. But like you said, it is a kind of abstraction, right? It's the world of the writers, it's the world of the text. And that also speaks to the methods that people use to study it, right? If you are starting with like the newspaper as your object and text-focused studies, the labor behind it is the secondary kind of question, right? So, and the place to find that is the archives related to legal and political. So, it's sort of like meeting these two things together in terms of the method. And in terms of the transnational kind of dimensions, I think the printing shop is a really interesting cosmopolitan space. I mean, all of the technologies, and I have an article coming out at some point maybe next year about like how printers actually got their supplies in Latin America. I sort of found there's some corporate archives that I consulted at Columbia University of this 19th century print manufacturing company based in New York, which has actual correspondence back and forth between printers ordering from catalogs and what gives you a little bit of a sense of how those networks worked. So, very few Mexican printers traveled. They're inland, it's expensive. You have to have a lot of money to be able to do that. So there are a few who do, but for the most part, I think that those communities happen through the exchange of print materials, right? And through the technologies. So you do for sure have imaginaries that link printers to the cult of Gutenberg, it's a sort of, and what those networks are. I mean, should I show this image that talks a little bit about this? Let me just fast forward a few images. This is one of my favorite documents that I found while doing research, this type specimen book that's, it's essentially, it was created in the National Government Printing Office as an accountability technique. Like some bureaucrats said, show us tell us the inventory of your printing shop. And so that means that you create this specimen where you print all examples of all your different collections of type. Now, I should have shown the contrasting image. This is not an orthodox specimen because it's supposed to say something like, what is the name of the type, right? What point size of the type is this? Maybe what drawer can I find this in if I need to find this again to use? These guys just kind of threw something together where they also kind of let their imaginations take precedence, right? And so I analyzed this specimen to see some of their political worldviews, and you can get a sense for that from some of these recognizable figures, right? Simon Bolivar, Jorge Washington, of course, Franklin is there. You have some socialism sprinkled in. You've got even the reformists, Lutero, Calvino, Savonarola, who are here not as kind of Protestants, but as sort of reformers, I think, anti-Inquisition type figures. Printing is light, right? So these kind of self-aggrandizing statements along with pointed political commentaries like the government print shop is in a terrible state, So these kind of documents give them a little bit of a clue as to the very kind of cosmopolitan worldview. And, it is very much oriented towards Mexico in a nationalist kind of way, but it places Mexico into what I would say would be a like France plus Southern European context. That's like they're interested in France, in Italy, and Spain, sort of the places where liberalism is like having its big struggles in the late 19th century, right? Where Mexico had sort of kicked out the French and they're feeling great in the 1870s. And Spain, France, and Italy are all like in the midst of those same kind of political conflicts. So I see it as a kind of Southern European liberal kind of imaginary, with a little socialism sprinkled in as a kind of interest, but not the primary at this point, not like a driving kind of feature of their worldview. And the North Atlantic world is like absent pretty much from their intellectual interests, like with a few exceptions, like what happens in the US and in England is like not really interesting to them. But that's, in spite of the fact that I think most of their technologies are coming from those spaces. So like there's this way materially that they're engaging with that North Atlantic world, and visually, because all of the visual images that are sort of pre-made images are coming from New York print shops. So there's like kind of multiple levels that those connections are happening. Yeah.
I have a question since we're talking about this muestra. It's a question about your relationship with the most material aspects of your archive. And I ask it precisely because you have this experience with printing that is exterior to or prior to your current professional situation. I was wondering, you do a great job in your work at narrating for your reader the printing shop as a space and making it palpable, focusing on the sensory, what it smells like, the sounds, all of that is there. I feel that when you give examples such as this one in your work, you're also engaging in part, I mean, at least visually now we're having this direct contact with this striking piece from the archive, right? And I was wondering, we've been talking about this and you think about how to communicate with that piece of the archive might tell us, but I wonder if there's also an area, border that you have identified in which the thing, it becomes just a thing. It's your own sensory curiosity, what draws you into a piece of the archive, into a muestra, for example, and maybe you struggle with how much to dwell on that or how much you should rationalize and put into words what you're feeling. I don't know, I'm just curious about that moment of your relationship as a historian printer with the archive of printing, right?
Well, one of the things that is so important about doing research in person, which is like the plug for supporting research, in archives as opposed to digital, which is important for some things, is the physicality of the documents themselves. Like this is a fairly small object, but one of the things that's amazing is when you find folded up things and you unfurl them and you realize how, the scale of how large things are, but also sometimes how small they are. Like you imagine the newspaper as this like big thing because you might think of a late 20th, early 21st century newspaper when, a 19th century newspaper like this big, so something about the scale is so important, I think, for how we kind of have a social understanding of how these things worked in a social context. You're not reading things pegged on the wall until later in the 19th century or whatever, right? So you kind of get a sense of the scale. And I mean, one of the things I will say about like working with materiality as like a thread to follow is that I never regretted going down a rabbit hole where I paid more and more attention to the physicality of the object. Like sometimes it seems like this is a bad idea, I should just stick to something more broad, but it almost always yields some unexpected insight or payoff. The payoff is always there. Like there's always something that comes from closer and closer attention to the object itself. So I feel like I go more and more down the rabbit hole, which is why now I'm looking at paper. It's like looking even closer at the object or touching it more instead of, looking through it with a light, instead of looking at it as a surface. So yeah, I mean, and things like, for example, with this document, noticing the quality of the printing, right? Like, is it very even? Can you tell that the text is broken? What can you learn from noticing typos or how people talk about typos or, strange workarounds that are used to take to overcome the fact that you might not have accents, the correct accents for your Spanish language type. So things like that. I think it is part of the toolkit. It's not like it is the only toolkit, but I think we should pay more attention to it as one of the dynamics or the methodologies that we use, to work with printed stuff. Yeah.
I guess we can open it up. Pablo,
Yeah, I need to leave. So I apologize. I just thank you for being here. It's wonderful seeing you. And great seeing the book out, and it's amazing. So my question is going to follow up a little bit what Victor was asking, and every time I read your work, there are these hints of almost Laturianity, sort of shadows or shades. And I was obviously one of the things that you do very well is to walk us into this space in which the material, the objects themselves are not separated, right, like from the social. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about how, for me, this is not the Laturian in which the agent is kind of away from the object itself, right? There is something that is more akin to what some archaeologists asking us to think about the close relations between human and non-human matter, and asking us to do something that they call assemblages of practice. That I think that is very powerful, and I see it happening in your space. The social in somehow, or the political, the cultural, which is what you have been saying, right? Another way of reading your work, we're saying that these things do not exist on their own and without this materiality and without the printed text and with the kind of paper that you're using. So I wanted to invite you to tell us a little bit more. And again, I'm sorry. I'm looking forward to more conversations.
Thank you. I like the way you phrased it, that these things don't, like the social, the cultural, the political doesn't exist without the material, right? And I think of these, how print functions in society as kind of linking people together, right? In not always in horizontal ways, right? Part of my argument is that these are kind of vertical relationships, right? And that print is just one of the material things in the world that humans create that helps to forge social relationships that are always, and this is part of why I have some skepticism of sort of horizontal human thing relations, right? Because I feel like this is very much, your relationship to print in some way is part of what reinforces or determines your social status, or they're interconnected, right? If you can afford to actually commission print and not sell it but give it to your friends, which I think is crazy. I was just on the plane reading something from the 20th century, a report about paper making, but it made this point that as we know today, like most of the stuff printed is not sold, it's distributed by people to their friends. I was like, oh my God, someone is actually saying this, because it's sort of, I don't know if it's right, but I think it is. A lot of what I saw was, thinking of why you commission print, it's not just for market purposes in a context where markets are very small and the number of readers, let alone paying customers, is smaller. You give it out to accomplish certain political or social goals, right? And this is what makes print powerful, I think, and also what makes it kind of something that leaves it open to kind of being appropriated or used to make claims. Right? So I do absolutely think that these are kind of, taking material objects is a way to sort of get inside of those powers, sort of see how printers function in a kind of quotidian way.
Thank you.
We have two questions. One, and maybe stop sharing the screen. Unless we want to give someone that I can change it to. I change it to brown. Stop sharing. Yes, I think that people can see.
Oh yeah, let me stop and share.
I'm going to read the first question, but you can also find it in the chat. So it says, Denise Castillo asks, what do you find is the connection between the reader and his physical sensation when encounter a primary source?
In terms of a today reader or a historical reader? I don't know. Let's see.
Maybe this connects a little bit with what you were telling, or both. Then it says both.
Yeah, both. Ooh. Yeah, I mean, like the tactile thing is important. I mean, I think people paid attention to paper more in the 19th century than they do today, maybe. Although maybe now we pay attention more because we touch it less, although we touch plenty of paper. I think that, you know, at least in the 19th century, I think in some ways handling paper is a specialist's job in some ways, right? To some degree, like if you're a scribe, you know, it's not that people who don't have access to literacy never touch paper, but like there's a sort of a group of professionals who have like a more honed sense of their relationship to documents. And they have lots of opinions about what paper is good, what paper is bad. I think what is familiar, what is strange. So I would guess that like tactile is one main way, but also the visual. I mean, text, you know, layout, design. The 19th century I found in Mexico is like a surprisingly text-heavy century of stuff. I mean, I think that we maybe I don't know if I'm going to say this and I believe it, but if we place more evidence on the visual because it's like exciting, but most of what was produced is actually just like blocks of texts. And there's like less of the image world than one would want to believe. And so I think that you know, text heavy print as a sort of visual, like these the blocks of just dense small letters, like in columns, or you know, is basically like one of the, I mean, you know, that and thinking about it, I mean, there are like the covers of 19th century printed documents have their own sort of grammar and style, right, that emerges over time, like and I think if we go to special collections later, probably there'll be some examples of that where it's like every single thing in the print shop that I can put in one space to show the range of my novelty, right, and make it exciting to viewers. The designer of my book kind of captured that aesthetic, I thought, really well, of all of the different typefaces that became like a big style, right? And so I think novelty does count for something, but you'll notice it's like textual novelty, right? So I don't want to say images don't matter, because of course lithography and all that stuff is coming in the 19th century, but I think especially because images are kind of more expensive, that text kind of ruled today.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Jorge Fragua says, I mainly work on the 16th century liturgical production from Spain from a design or physical perspective. I was wondering about the role of the church in all this control process in the late 19th century Mexico. Also, if the control process of any political force leads to a physical or to physical changes on the books through the variation of its content, and if there are documents about it.
Okay, that's such an interesting question, especially in the second part about if in politics influence the aesthetics of print. I mean, there were certainly rules about that, that thing about the responsible category. You had to print, by law, you were required to print the print shop on your printed document. The author could be anonymous, but you did have to produce, include this pie de imprenta, which the imprint information, which said the location of your print shop, so that you could be judged or tracked down, if need be. So that definitely provides a kind of structure to every title page in the 19th century. Even there is a moment when liberals, in their attempts to create individual authorship, ban anonymous printing that actually happens for a period of time. And so it's the individual author must be there somewhere on the page, but that doesn't last for that long before it's sort of changed around. So that for sure, I mean, it's an interesting question, and one that I think I want to talk to you more about. The question of the church is that, yeah, there's definitely kind of conflicts over church power. And one of my chapters writes about that. The Catholic Church retained censorship authority into the 19th century, but only on topics related to religion. Now, the question of what was a religious work, of course, is kind of open to interpretation. And one of the chapters I write about novel, this French novel that's translated about, it's called The Mysteries of the Inquisition, which is like a bodice ripper, anti-clerical novel that shows the evil Grand Inquisitor of 16th century Spain trying to defile virgins, etc. And the Catholic Church tries to get it censored because it deems it a religious work because of the content, and also because it has the right under this liberal regime that's essentially like, one of my colleagues, Pablo Mijangos described it as a Catholic liberalism, right? This world where the state is trying to coexist with the church, which is the most powerful, the largest landowner, a powerful actor, wealthy. And so this sort of shared system doesn't really work. The state doesn't ever really take it very seriously. The church always feels like it's not being taken seriously enough. And they try to kind of reassert their power by the mid-19th century. But it sort of doesn't, it ultimately leads to, along with in many other areas, the church and state sort of parting ways after a civil war, right? So it's sort of an unresolvable tension. And, print is one of those areas where church and state are sort of fighting over who controls what aspects, right? So it sort of illuminates that historical conflict. Thank you.
Questions in the room?
Hi, thanks for this. I was running, I'm trying to hold back a little because I'm going to talk about paper making and I knew other, but this is actually to this image you showed of the snake encircling press and thinking of this as not exactly metaphorical because there's sort of criminal investigation approach, finding, who done it, right? Who's responsible. And I wondered, have you come across anything where, as we know, as you said at the beginning, there's a reliance on imported supplies, and there's a point where you're starting maybe trying to fill in that gap with maybe locally made supplies, but that transition would give you to continue the analogy, a smoking gun, right? You should be able to kind of see from the paper, at least where things were sourced. Is there a sense of that criminal investigation goes to the level of paper?
No, not with paper, but with type. That was the thing that like Yodel was saying, that they basically, say, well, we all import our type, so you can't tell. It's sort of part of the argument. Paper, and that's such it's a great question, actually. Like I didn't come across any of that in my research, but now that I'm working on paper, I'm gonna think about if I can find evidence of that. There is a sort of conversation about, is our paper made here good or bad? And in comparison to what, and I think that it just depends on what side of the argument you're on, whether you're pro paper maker or pro printer, because actually they develop a conflict in the beginning in the 1840s. And I'm writing about this month, called the paper question, which, of many 19th century questions, there was a paper question. And it was debated. I'm shocked by how long this went on in Mexico for 100 years. And it never died. The knowledge and memory of how long it was is not as long as the historical record, right? People think that it's been debated for 25 years, and they don't really realize that it's like so long of a conversation. But at some point, printers decide that Mexican-made paper is bad, or they just hate paper makers and have conflicts with them over pricing or purchasing agreements, or I don't really know yet. We've been able to figure out like where the there is on this question. But it becomes something that journalists also appropriate over time, and ultimately sort of ends in the creation of a state paper making business in the 1930s under Lázaro Cárdenas, who makes state everything. So it's sort of like this. It's another kind of long thread that I'm going to be exploring in my next project. This question of like how the materiality of paper matters politically. So yeah, let's talk to you about it.
We have another question from Alex Chaparro Silva. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Corinna. Can you tell us more about the process of paper making and circulation of paper in Mexico during the 19th century? Have you identified some circuits of commerce of paper between Mexico and South America or the Caribbean?
Ooh, so the circuits are still unclear to me. I found, it sounds like a lot of the paper is imported from. So historically, it comes through Spain. That doesn't mean it was made in Spain in the colonial era. It might have been Italian or other places. In the 19th century, my sense is that Italy is still big, especially for cigarette papers. Papel genovese, so Genoese paper, it's still in the category. But the Northeast US and Germany, I think, are going to become bigger suppliers over this course of the 19th century, because these are also emerging as paper industrial sites that are becoming kind of global in their scale. And then the other thing to think about is domestic paper in Mexico, where does it get its raw materials? Because at first it's rags, and the rag market is global by this point. So I don't know where the rags are coming from, but I have a wonderful quote from a lawmaker who's just horrified by these foreign rags sitting on the Mexican docks, how humiliating is it that we have to depend on these stinking foreign cast-offs, and when we have lots of materials here. So the idea in the 19th century, of course, is what other materials can we use to make paper from besides rags, since there are not enough rags in the world to make all the paper that we need. And so in Mexico, the big material of interest is maguey, the agave plant, and whether this can be harnessed as the ancestors. I mean, the idea is that the pre-Columbian kingdoms used agave to make their paper, which I think mostly they used the mulberry tree. I'm not sure what the history of agave paper is in the pre-Columbian era. I haven't been able to figure out if that's just an idea that intellectuals have about the pre-Columbian past, or really part of pre-Columbian paper making. And as for commerce, I've seen examples of people saying, wouldn't it be great if we could export our paper? But in Mexico, basically, I mean, most people are saying we can't even supply our own markets with paper that we need. So I don't think that there was a ton of export, but if you have any tips about that, Alex, we should talk, because there may be circuits that I don't know about.
No, one more question, but we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so Laura Varela asks, I was very curious about the idea of who is responsible, quote unquote, responsible for a text, and how the printers were implicated or not. Considering these, I wanted to ask if you could speak to how people were establishing networks between suppliers, printers, and authors and others. Were these networks fluid, or have you noticed more consistent relationships that persist? And in the latter, who do those speak to this question of who is ultimately quote unquote responsible?
Yeah, that's a good question. Definitely partisan networks emerge with printing. You print with your printer. If you're a liberal, you go to this guy. If you're a conservative, you go to that guy. The conservatives tend to seem to last less long than the liberals. They have less, sometimes they get, one of the things I've noticed is how liberals and conservatives respond differently to their enemies in the print shop. Conservatives have this plan to sort of control everything in the print shop or leverage the social world to control print. But liberals, when they come to power, just destroy the printing shops of the conservative printers. They seem to me to use to kind of encourage a kind of more sacking approach. I'm talking about a small handful of cases, so I don't know if I want to generalize completely, but the conservatives kind of try to make, harass people in the day-to-day, whereas the liberals take revenge after they come back to power. And for sure, the ways that these partisan networks form means that if your group is out of power, you sort of lose commissions, right? So there's these sort of periods where you're doing probably better and periods when you're doing less well. So I do think that there is a kind of up and down in people's economic fortunes, depending on the political winds. But and some people printed for the church, right? Which the church was going to give its business to conservative printers, right? And so conservatives weren't going to kind of take a political stand on the question of the church's role in adjudicating press freedom because they needed the business of the church, right? So there are definitely kind of considerations about those networks. But I do think, a lot of it is printers' workshops are very close to the downtown where people went for, close to Congress. close to the church, the cathedral. So these sort of social worlds are very closely overlapping, right? It's like the lettered, I don't think this is a lettered barriada in my case, right? But this is still a sort of lettered city world, right? Where people sort of, the printers kind of overlap with those circuits more broad.
Are there any other questions? I have a question that I wanted to ask, maybe gearing us towards your next project, because I think there's some interest in on paper. One of the things that I really like about your book also is the sort of the political dimensions of printmaking throughout the 19th century. And as you mentioned, that was not originally what you intended to work on, the politics of all of this. But I wonder so I want to ask you about your next project on paper and how are these tensions between conservatives and liberals, if there are, materializing in the production and distribution of paper. And so I guess, how does your next project connect to your book, how it stems from it? And I was wondering if there were also this sort of political ramifications of the production of paper itself.
Yeah, I've noticed, one of the big sort of ideological contentions around paper is, should it be imported or manufactured domestically? And that sort of depends in part on whether you're a liberal free trader, a libre-cambista, who thinks that Mexico should pursue a comparative advantage and, import the stuff that it doesn't do well and export the stuff that it does do well, or if Mexico should take a kind of this sort of developmentalist approach to industrializing and trying to follow the pathway of England, which is always held up as the shining example of using protectionism to grow into a world power, right? So of course, free traders think England is a free trade nation, and protectionists think England is a protectionist nation. So like everybody sort of uses different readings of other cases around the world. So there's this very sort of like path. We need to put ourselves on the best path to achieve material prosperity, and paper is definitely part of that goal. Both, paper is so essential for state builders in their daily lives. They all have opinions about it because they work with it all the time. They kind of think they're experts and they can bring their anecdotal knowledge to bear on these things without ever doing a real study, because there's a lot of projects to understand a comprehensive study of like how we make paper in Mexico, how much do we make, how much does it cost, how much does it cost in relation to paper in New York. But ultimately, nobody ever makes that study. They just sort of talk past each other. And so there's, in a way, it's like always it's born political, this debate about paper. And I'm sort of struggling to figure out like if it's just political, or if there's something, if it's like a partisan debate that's purely formulated in advance and just kind of applied onto paper, or if it's, in what ways it kind of emerges through ground level. In the sense that this issue is the product of printers, it emerges out of a kind of material environment, but it quickly sort of, the printers support this free trade position, which is interesting because most artisans are protectionists in the 19th century, right? They want to have their manufacturers protected, their, whatever, from foreign imports, but printers are like, open the floodgates, picture, So that's sort of a way in which they're more, the nature of their work makes them more oriented towards to these sort of foreign, sort of cosmopolitan ideas, Yeah.
I also have a question that it's about paper, your new project, but also about ink remains, because it's about basically printed paper, from what you were saying, is sometimes considered very violent, meaning scarce. And for example, when we think of paper as materialities, there's never enough paper, we should import paper, paper is too expensive. But then you give us clues as to value judgments that consider that there's just too much paper, too many things being printed. This is, I learned today, a banned books week. And there's this tension. It seems that at times there's either too much printed paper or not enough. And this kind of situation in which we assign value to a particular piece of paper seem like actually very extraordinary, right? And I was wondering if in your work, you found more references to this, because I remember when I was working on newspapers, there's always complaints about the fact that people were printing just to print. There were no news, but you still needed to fill in the space. And of course, the question of the low value of what people publish, right? Because you do mention that people often print and distribute to friends. But when you mentioned that, what I immediately thought was like, yeah, and those friends will never read what they're given. Right, so there's this question of like all this paper for nothing. I wonder if that's something that's factoring in the new project in particular, because it seems to be this national question, right? Like, oh, we don't have enough paper, but do we actually need more paper?
Yeah,
I don't know.
need the right kind of paper. No, this is an interesting reflection. Because of course there's that whole kind of discourse on novels being frivolous and why do we shouldn't have this kind of material. But then there's also the argument that we'll never be an educated population if we don't have cheap paper. And the question, one of the things that I found in these debates about paper is this issue of like what makes for readers, like how are readers made, is very connected to the question of paper. If it's cheap material, does cheap print produce readers? And I think most people think that the print itself is sort of magically going to generate the readers. And there's really no conversation about education factoring into it. Like there's sometimes which will be like, like our population's mostly literate, so I don't think that they're going to have much use for this material. But most of the time that does not even kind of come on the radar. And it's like, we will always be, illiterate and doomed to be behind in this whole discourse about atraso if we can't get this magical potential of cheap print. Because the idea, I think, is that the US, this is another like looking, the other comparison drawn with the US, that the reason they're doing so great and they have so many readers is because paper and print are cheap. And so the idea is if we could just lower the costs enough, like the market will just generate on its own. It's kind of like how do you create markets for products kind of conversation, but without the literacy part, it's an interesting thing to think about.
Can I ask one more? Sure. Have you delved into what is the politics of paper right now? Because, or in recent years, because during the pandemic, when the world went upside down, there was a lack of everything, among other things, paper. And I remember I was in South America in the process of publishing a book, and there was no paper. So the production had to be halted, stopped. And then I learned that in Chile, where I am from, there's one kind of paper being produced, and paper for books has to be imported from Finland. So literally the other side of the world, which makes the product more expensive. And then the Finnish installed a paper factory in Uruguay, which was very controversial on the border with, big controversy, because it's a big pollutant, paper industry. So, and I'm old enough to remember the early days of massive internet when we were all saying, we're not going to need more books. The books are over, and now there's more books.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. The biggest thing that's driving paper production is e-commerce now, right? Like most of the paper products are boxes. Right, that's what's cutting down the Amazon. So, or dealing with kind of the creation of monoculture tree plantations, right? But it's super, what you say is super interesting. And the pandemic, I want to write a chapter on toilet paper. This is one of my desires, because I'm also curious about paper beyond print, right? Like it's so dispersely, especially for us academics, it's so linked in our minds with writing and books and things, but like it's a whole industry by the 20th century, the paper and pulp industry, right? Or whatever, it's paper products industry, and it has this, there's so many of them that people talk about. for packaging, you know, the toilet paper market. And this is also linked to that question, if we can only make it cheap, everyone will want to use it. It's about market creation, right, about commerce. And the paper industry becomes global at a certain point, right? So, you know, you do have mills that specialize in particular things and others that, you know, make other things. And I subscribe to, you know, I'm just learning all this stuff, but I subscribe to these industry, you know, newsletters that they announce every time a paper mill opens and like what kind of, because they're incredibly capital intensive. And they only have a few people who work in that. I mean, I don't know how many people work in a paper factory, but just to create one on site is like a hugely expensive endeavor. And it's like a really difficult business to keep up with. And they're constantly, if you follow the news, they're constantly being shut down and then maybe reopened, but like for a different kind of paper. So there's like this whole like, yeah, I mean, Finland and like in Scandinavia and obviously the US and Canada were big producers in the 20th century. And the different regions in, you know, first the Northeast in the US, then the South, depending on sort of processes that were. So I'm definitely interested in like where Mexico fits in those global stories. I don't have the answer though exactly yet.
Well, there was a brilliant poet who typed his poems on
The toilet paper. Yeah.
So
This is fantastic. I need to include that in my research.
Any other questions or comments?
Oh, I'd like to think of this diversification of, you know, we talk about paper now and paper then, and it's just so different, right? As this last question brought up, the diversification, once you start making paper for other reasons than printing. And that happens once, you know, really in the middle of what I didn't know about the paper question that you were excited to read more about it. But, you know, globally that happens in the middle of that period when the source shifts from used rags to trees, right? And so that's like first newspaper printed on tree paper in the US is 1863. So then suddenly you begin to, you're no longer using the paper from print or from a manuscript for toilet paper for you know, wrapping fish for, you know, and you start to make, you know, wrapping paper and toilet paper and all these other kinds of things. But it's so interesting that the period you're looking at really like lands right there. I'm very excited to see where it takes.
It's fun because, you know, I think that Mexico in some way, I mean, it's like when does tree paper arrive in Mexico? It's always obviously being imported right away, but I think that manufacturers don't really do that until the very end of the 19th century. So you still have a rag, you know, so it's interesting because the places that are most studied when we think about paper are like the industrial core, right? Like New England, or France, where, you know, they're inventing these new paper machines, and England, they can create it without the dude shaking it himself, you know. So, you know, Mexico is like the other half of that story, which is actually much more typical of global experience, right? So I think part of why, you know, I enjoy, or why I think it's important to study these many people have written about the history of printed paper, but, you know, the narratives are so much told from the core. And these are, you know, the most of the world's experience with paper look quite different, right? So I think it's important to take on these topics from other situations, other locations. Yeah.
Other comments or questions?
Yeah, I would like to ask about ink.
What about
Ink? Like, since you are also worried about the circulation and the production of paper, and also the appearance of paper as a trope, does ink have the same, I don't know, like weight in the debates?
I haven't seen it in the same way. That's an interesting question. Yeah, it's funny that the thing that is so key for like one of the underappreciated but very important aspects of printing. Honestly, I have never heard a polemic about it or came across.
And about the product itself, like
Yeah,
the existence
how
or
it's
the
made.
supplies?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is imported at a certain point, probably before the 19th century. It's made on site, and you know, there's like it would be interesting to study like the way that I think her name is it Pamela? She's based at Columbia and she does this hands-on early modern artisan experiments. Is it Pamela Smith or Pamela Wong? There are two Pamelas. Smith, yeah. And then so she did this whole like embodied artisanship project where they created like a lab and they tried to remake all these items from early modern recipes. And it's super interesting. I mean, it would be interesting to do something like that for Latin America because for sure materials are being used locally. You know, the ways that indigenous people made ink before the conquest are factoring in, at least in the beginning, to how people think about ink. I think, you know, people like Alex Hidalgo and Barbara Bundy write a lot about those processes. But in the 19th century, I think at a certain point, you know, everything does shift to sort of importing because it's cheaper and easier, although I could be wrong. I mean, one of the things I noticed is there are small scale manufacturing always happening on site, right? So even type, which is pretty difficult to make, I think, having not made it myself. Actually, I did find make type one, but with monotype machine. You know, there are sort of small scale manufacturers who like fill in the gaps for things, but don't necessarily produce in large quantities. So for sure, there are some ink makers that I just don't know about. But by the turn of the 20th century, you have like US businesses doing pretty hard sells throughout Latin America. So I think you could just go to your supplier and it's easy.
Thank you.
Are there other questions, Gloria, from public? Well, thanks so much, Corinna.
Thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We will have a recording of this session and I'll have getting some emails about the readings. So if you still need the readings, let me know. You can send me an email and I can share those with you. Thank you so much for coming, for being here. Thank you.